Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Session 2, Day 1, Cycle 2015. We have the great pleasure and honor of having Tom Palmer, scholar of the Cato Institute and numerous other libertarian organizations that I won't list because there are too many. The man has many credits to his name, but most important, he's a sound thinker, a careful thinker with a lot of important things to say. So Tom, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Lobo. I hope that it's worth people's time to tune into this particular one. I've been on the road for quite a while, traveling, meeting with people who are advocating liberty. It's a great privilege to have the job that I have, to be able to immerse myself in the promotion of liberty. And what I want to talk about is the theme about what it means to love the freedom of other people. And I start out with a very simple point, and that is about my own personal life. Let me find this here and share it. And when I think about what I did this evening earlier on when I had dinner with colleagues here in Bhutan, I'm right now in the Kingdom of Bhutan on the slopes of the Himalayas. When I alter my brain chemistry, these are the ingredients that I use. I use them in moderation, but I do enjoy them, namely grapes and hops. I don't use these. I don't use marijuana. I don't use other intoxicating substances or drugs. But it doesn't follow because of that I am indifferent to the freedom of those who do smoke marijuana. In fact, their freedom is very, very important to me. I don't smoke. I don't use any illegal narcotics, but I'm upset, angry, very, very involved in the movement to legalize narcotics for those who do choose to use them. If someone wants to smoke marijuana and they are not posing a threat to anyone else, they're not flying an airplane at me or doing anything like that, but just peacefully enjoying their brain chemical of choice, it's their right, it's their freedom. And when other people's lives are fundamentally ruined because they owned a plant or because they engaged in a pleasure that other people don't approve of, and they're imprisoned and subject to all kinds of terrible violence, that is important to me. It's not merely my freedom to do what I want that matters, but the freedom of other people as well. I was thinking about this the other day and realized that I've been involved in the movement, actively involved, to end the war on drugs for a very long time. When I was a college student in 1973, so that's a fair number of years ago, I was involved as the chairman of an organization to legalize marijuana. There was an initiative on the ballot to eliminate criminal penalties for people who used marijuana. And on my college campus, at the University of Southern California, I worked with others to promote that initiative to change the law. No one in our group actually smoked marijuana. That was interesting to some people. I did know that people on the other side did smoke marijuana, and yet they were opposed to any change in the law. So I've been working for this cause for over 42 years. And I have to say we're winning in many countries, including the United States, but other countries as well. I'm so excited that Canada, Justin Trudeau announced they will begin to eliminate criminal penalties for marijuana. It was worth it. All of the effort, all of that work was worth it. If someone going out there enjoying their drug of choice is not beaten, harassed, imprisoned, denied their freedom because of my efforts, it was worth it. I'm inspired by a great figure, Joaquim Nabuco. He was an enemy of slavery in Brazil. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to officially eliminate slavery. And Nabucco made it his life's cause. He was not a slave. He was a free person, but he worked for the freedom of other people. In his book that he wrote on abolitionism after their triumph, he put it very beautifully. You should educate your children and educate yourself in the love for the freedom of others. For only in this way will your own freedom not be a gratuitous gift from fate. You'll be aware of its worth, and you will have the courage to defend it. I think that states very neatly what it means to be a friend of liberty. It's not just about my freedom, about doing what I want, but it's about the freedom of any human being to enjoy her life or his life as that person sees fit, so long as they don't violate the equal rights, the equal freedom of other people. There's a global movement for liberty, and it's quite remarkable that that movement is based on a very simple principle: live and let live. Now, sometimes the application may involve complexity. One has to become educated about public policy and philosophy and economics and other topics. But nonetheless, the basic principle is pretty clear and simple. Live and let live. Enjoy your life and allow other people the freedom to enjoy theirs. Their freedom is important as well. So sometimes when we go out and we engage in public discussion, advocates of personal liberty are accused of being selfish, of only caring about themselves. Nothing could be further than the truth. Now, you are important. Your own self is important. You should care about your freedom, about your well-being. There's no question about that. But it does not follow that you care only about your own personal freedom. Because to believe in freedom means that you believe in the freedom of other people as well. It means you don't hit other people when their behavior displeases you. You don't steal their stuff when you would like to have it. Instead, you ask them, what would you take in exchange for that? What would induce you voluntarily to give that to me? It might be an act of exchange. It might be something else. But you don't use force and violence on other people. And you don't engage in fraud to trick or cheat people out of what is theirs or to cause harm to them. This is pretty simple, and indeed most people all the time follow those principles in their interaction with other people. Unfortunately, many people believe that a special class of people are exempt from these principles. They're called politicians or kings or generals or potentates, that those people have the right and the power to coerce others. In my opinion, this is a myth. It's a belief in magic, a holdover from before the Enlightenment. And we need to rid ourselves of that view and understand every human being counts for something. There's no person who is born into this world above the rest of us to rule us or to coerce us. We don't exist for the sake of that other person. And that means also the recognition other people don't exist for my sake. They aren't here for me to boss around or to coerce or to violate their rights and freedom. So live and let live means the freedom of one person or one group does not diminish the freedom of anyone else. And that's a very, very important point. It's an important principle. You can enjoy your freedom, and it doesn't mean that I have any less freedom. There's no conflict between your freedom and mine. We can both enjoy them equally. This is something that was very important to many philosophers, such as Immanuel Kant, who based his whole theory of justice on that fundamental recognition. Now, there's a lot more in Kant, obviously, and anyone who's read him recognizes what a complex philosophical edifice he created. But that fundamental idea that your freedom and my freedom need not be in conflict is a key to understanding liberty and justice. And as a consequence, there is a global movement for liberty. It's present and spreading on every continent except one, Antarctica, and I think that'll come at some point. It's in every religious group, every ethnic group, every nation. There are people who love freedom, and they understand that their freedom is compatible with the freedom of other people. Now, if you think about that from an economic perspective or the perspective of political science, we should also recognize a very important principle, that the gain of one person need not mean the loss of another. just as your freedom and my freedom can both exist at the same time. There's no set amount of freedom such that if you have more, I have to have less. All kinds of other gains are compatible with mutual benefit and mutual enjoyment of gains and benefits. So let's take a very simple example in social interaction. We can think about game payoffs, or what's sometimes called game theory. Now, many people believe that human interactions are characterized by what is called a zero-sum payoff. The sum of the payoffs is zero. So x plus y is equal to 0. In other words, if you gain 10 units, 10 euros, $10, 10 renminbi, or 10 apples, someone else must have lost 10. Or two people must have lost 5 each. That for every gain, there's a corresponding loss. That's a very common way to look at the world, but it's fundamentally wrong. Zero-sum games almost never happen. They happen on blackboards, but in real life, you almost never encounter them. Instead, what we encounter more frequently are negative-sum games, in which the sum of the payoffs is less than 0. So the gain to one person is less than the loss to another. These are actually quite common. They're all around us. Most acts of theft or robbery or assault are zero-sum games. Someone may be walking down the street, another person attacks that person, beats them, stabs that person, and gets the money in the person's wallet. So let's say it's $50. But the cost of the person who lost is much higher than $50, having to go to the hospital, medical bills, lost income, as well as all of the suffering. So most of those interactions that are violent or coercive are negative-sum games. And indeed, if you think about corruption in state interaction, it's almost always, I shouldn't say almost always, it is always a negative-sum game. Dictators who loot their countries and steal from the people over whom they rule get staggering amounts of money. But the amount that they have stolen is less than the harm that they have caused to the people. That's why after the dictator is overthrown and people go into their palaces and say, where's all the wealth? Turns out there isn't that much to compensate those who lost. I'm going to be traveling from Bhutan, where I am right now, to Ukraine for another big conference of people who love liberty in Kiev and another in Odessa. And it was quite remarkable that the last president who left the country left behind unbelievable palaces and some of the worst, tackiest taste in furniture and other things you could imagine. When people went through and saw this, they understood that that had been taken from them, that had been looted from the taxpayers of the country. But the value of those palaces is a tiny fraction of the harm that was done to the people. So negative-sum games are all around us. They're quite common. But there's another kind of game as well.
Tom, forgive me for jumping in, Tom, but I just want you to know that your slides are not progressing with you. So if you have slides to accompany these points, we're still looking at the grapes.
I see. Well, I've been pressing the button here, so let me see what is happening here.
There you go. I'll step aside now. Just wanted you to know.
Now you can see the zero-sum game?
Now we can. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that. My screen was showing it, and yours was not. Well, I was discussing zero-sum games, negative-sum games, and now positive-sum games, in which the sum of the payoffs is greater than 0. Those are all around us as well. They're acts of voluntary interaction. If you go into the store, for example, and you buy something, voluntarily interacting with another person, it's characterized by something quite remarkable. It's called a double thank you. That is to say, I go into the store, I want to buy something, the merchant gives it to me, I hand over the money, and I say thank you, and the merchant says thank you as well. If you think about it, that's kind of weird. Normally, when I say thank you to another person, that person says, you're welcome. But in this case, voluntary exchange, we both say thank you. That tells us this is a positive sum game. And interactions of a voluntary nature where both parties agree to interact and there's no coercion are characterized as positive sum games. Both of them are benefiting. The sum of the benefits is positive. What we need for free and prosperous societies is a set of rules and freedoms that make positive sum games the norm. So let's go back to just seeing me and not seeing the slide. One of the things that I'm involved in with the freedom movement is making positive sum interactions the norm. First, they're based on voluntary interaction, so they're compatible with freedom, they advance freedom. And second, they bring about a world of greater peace and greater prosperity. At the moment, I'm in Bhutan at the Economic Freedom Network of Asia with Friends of Liberty from all across Asia who have come together to discuss how to diminish coercion in their societies and how to bring about more voluntary cooperation through greater trade, voluntary exchange across international borders, and diminishing violent conflict among and between states. As I mentioned, I'll be going on from this to Ukraine, where there are conferences being held by Read.com and the Bendukidze Free Market Center and others to promote Ukraine and the region as a set of positive sum games, voluntary interactions that provide mutual benefits for everyone. And then finally on to the Arab Liberty Festival. People in the Arab world who love liberty will be gathering in Marrakesh at the end of November, and I'll be honored to be among them to talk about how to advance liberty in Arab societies, and then also broadly there's a substantial overlap between the Arab world and the Muslim world in the wider Muslim world as well. We should be very careful. Not all Arabs are Muslims, and most Muslims are not Arabs, but there's a substantial overlap, and both of those themes, Arab countries and the Muslim world, will be topics of great discussion to promote freedom in those societies. Well, with that, I'd like to turn it over for a conversation and discussion about the possibility of a world in which my freedom is compatible with yours. That happens to be the world we actually live in. Back to you, Lobo.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry about the snafu with the slides, but that was very interesting to hear the ideas framed in terms of the zero-sum game. A lot of people have heard that expression, but I hadn't actually seen the equations, and I hadn't seen the framing of reality in terms of the negative gain and the positive gain that you posited. That's a very useful way of thinking about it, I think. So going from theory to the real world, let's talk about, maybe just to start, well, I'm sure we'll have questions from the audience shortly, but just to start, the big tragedy of the day is this big shooting in Paris and all the responses that we're seeing. In addition to the tragedy of the deaths and the humans involved on the scene, we're seeing a horrific carnage happening to civil liberties around the world. Borders are closing. If you are unfortunate enough to have brown skin and wear a turban, you may be a Sikh, but nobody cares. You look like one of those ragheads to a certain mindset. I mean, the consequences of this are horrific. And not just for French people, but for Muslims, for everybody. It seems like a horrible real-life example of a negative sum gain. But how do we do what you just say? How do we find a solution? How do we deal with a problem like this and still recognize your freedom and mine?
The first point in this context is to be rational. To think about these things. There's a principle that I think is wise for everyone. It's good to help children to understand this, but we adults should remind ourselves as well. Think, first you should stop, think, and then decide. If you just immediately react, in most circumstances, make the wrong decision. So it's important to think about what is the right response in this context. Those horrible murders that were carried out by people who are members of an apocalyptic death cult. They are, in fact, very dangerous. They have killed many thousands of people already. The vast bulk of their victims are not in Europe, they're not in Paris, they're in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Egypt and other countries as well, where Islamic State is the most virulent, most horrifying extremist group of this movement. So scary that they were disavowed by Al-Qaeda, is victimizing people as we speak. So do not minimize the danger that they pose. They do not share the philosophy of live and let live. As the leaders of Al-Qaeda had put it some time ago, and Islamic State has amplified this dramatically, they say, we love death more than you love life. So they have to be defeated. But they need to be defeated in a smart way. What's happening right now, in my opinion, is a great deal of security theater. Actions that are taken to make us feel something is being done.
Yes.
But the question is it actually doing any good? So let's wind back the clock a little bit to the 9/11 attacks, those horrific attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, and think about what happened afterwards. We got the Transportation Safety Administration in the U.S., a whole bunch of additional restrictions rippled out from that around the world, including that you cannot travel without a government-issued ID because terrorists never have government-issued ID. All of these restrictions on our behavior. And many of them had nothing to do with security. The idea that anyone was going to hijack an airplane again is really quite absurd. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen because all the passengers understand it's going to be flown into a building and they're all going to die. So stopping a grandmother because she has knitting needles or taking your nail clippers, patting down babies inside their diapers and so on, these assaults on our dignity have not made us any safer. There are security questions, as we've seen in the recent issue in Sinai, about putting bombs on airplanes. In my opinion, that's a more serious area where there needs to be probably more effort put by airlines and security companies and baggage handlers. That's a greater vulnerability. But most of the effort has gone instead to the thing that we can see, this security theater, to make everyone feel something is being done, even if that something isn't having any positive impact. So let's move up to what's happened right now. I think that the restrictions on border crossings are irrational. They're not going to stop terrorists. They will cause substantial harm to millions and millions of people. But as we saw, evidently, the person who organized the Paris attacks had slipped back and forth between France and Syria despite being on these watch lists. So how is it that stopping someone delivering milk from going across the border, having to show an ID and so on, is going to stop terrorists? This is security theater, and I think that these restrictions on our freedom are unjustified, even within the context of those who believe that there are trade-offs between security and freedom. These are irrational, in my opinion. And what is needed is to think seriously and carefully about what will help us to secure our freedom, not to be killed, not to be in airplanes that are blown up, and so on, and to do so rationally without sacrificing all of our other freedoms in a great emotional overreaction. So this is a good example of why reason is important, reason and evidence, and not merely emotive reactions. There's a syllogism of emergencies that statesmen, politicians like to use. It goes as follows. Something must be done. This is something. Therefore, this must be done. And that's effectively the logic that we're being told, without being told, in fact, this is the thing that will help to secure our freedom to protect our lives, and here's how and why. We're just told something has to be done. And when politicians talk like that, you can be pretty sure nothing good will come of it.
Okay, we have a question for you. Can you give us some examples of positive sum gains, real-world interactions, besides your money exchange at the supermarket example?
Love. Love
That's a beautiful example.
Because two people who cherish and love each other, each one has his or her life enriched. So that's a positive sum game. It's unfortunate. Maybe I shouldn't have started out with this little active exchange that we trade a piece of metal for something else, and we both say thank you. But love is surely a positive sum game when two people love each other. Now, sometimes there might be negative, or let's say zero-sum games, if two people love the same other person who doesn't love both of them. There are cases, of course, in life in which our interests do not always coincide. I don't want to suggest that there are no conflicts of interest, by no means. That would be absurd. There are conflicts of interest. But there are also occasions in which interests coincide and people benefit mutually from interaction. So exchange in the market, love, I would say also all other kinds of voluntary interaction in which people do things out of a concern for the well-being of others. So charitable work, for example, is not a zero-sum game. To characterize an act of charity as a zero-sum game would suggest that you should resent having to help the other person. But in fact, true acts of charity, when you really help another person, are good for you as well. It's not just the other person who benefited, and somehow you're harmed by it and you should be bitter. Your life has been enriched. You've done a good thing. You get to feel good about yourself. You get a reward. You give, to take a small example, I support a hospital in Ethiopia, a fistula hospital. It helps young girls and women who have suffered really terrible injuries. If they have been married off at a very, very young age to an older man who then rapes them, it can cause tearing. And this causes physical harm to them that is extremely debilitating. I won't go into the details, but you could imagine. It makes them unmarriable and undesirable. And they're cast out and become, in some cases, exiles from their communities. And this hospital is able to save their lives for very modest sums of money by providing them the surgery that can repair the harm that was done by these acts of rape against very young and vulnerable girls. When I send money to do that, I get the feeling, the positive benefit, that there's some young girl whose life now will be allowed to be completed as a happy person. He won't suffer anymore. So I don't feel bitter and resentful that I sent my money so that she could have a life. So I think even charity is an act that is a positive sum game when you look at it in the context of what moves us. It's not just an exchange. I do give something, but I do, as a consequence, benefit from it. I get to have the knowledge that I helped another person who was in need. So once you think about it, these kinds of positive sum games are all around us, but most people ignore them. They don't see them. And they're locked into this mentality that everything is a zero-sum game, that the benefit of one has to be at the expense of another. Now there's a flip side of that, by the way, another very common mistake. And that is the view, if someone was harmed, another person must have benefited. That is also false. Sometimes someone is harmed and another person benefited. So the thief comes, hits me on the head, and takes my wallet. The thief got my $50 and I was harmed. But there are many cases in which someone is harmed but to no benefit of another person. So let's take a very simple example of an imperialist aggressor. Take the Soviet Union and its aggression against little neighboring states that were gobbled up into it. One might say, well, somehow the Russians benefited from that because they were the dominant ethnic group in the Soviet Union. But they didn't. At the end of the Soviet Union, they were desperately poor. There was nothing to redistribute to the other people. Everyone was a loser in that horrific enterprise. Most acts of tyranny like that are negative-sum games. So we not assume that if there's a beneficiary, someone who gained, that there must be someone who lost. And similarly, we should not assume that because we see a loser, there must have been a net gainer as well. Those simply do not follow.
Those are very good words. I'm reminded of how when I was a teenager listening to The Who, there was a song that went, in life, 1 and 1's not 2, it's 1. But I always thought, or when I felt it, it wasn't 1, it was more like 10 or 100. I mean, when you're in love, it doesn't feel like I've been reduced or diminished. It feels like everything is possible. Sorry, we have sort of a libertarian nerd question here, if you will, because you mentioned Immanuel Kant, who is one of several people that Ayn Rand once accused of being the most destructive man in all history or something like that. She found some room to disagree with him. But do you have any comments on that? I mean, Rand once dismissed Kant as being a destructive philosopher, and here you are basing some of your arguments on Kant's philosophy. And you've never said the word objectivist, but you understand the question.
Yes, I think I do. Not so much basing my views on Kant's philosophy, but suggesting that they're compatible, that Kant was trying to get at this idea of equal freedom as a foundation for justice. In all seriousness, I don't think she understood Kant's enterprise. And she went overboard rhetorically in her criticisms, as sometimes people do. But I think that it was unjustified, and I think overall Kant should be understood as a friend of freedom and a figure of the Enlightenment. So I don't think that she got him right, and I was struck many years ago. I read her book, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. It's been many decades ago, and I was struck by how similar it was to Immanuel Kant's metaphysics. And I mentioned this to some of Ayn Rand's more enthusiastic followers, and sometimes they get a little bit upset. And I've talked to some, though, who are much more serious philosophers. They say, well, there are important but subtle differences. I think, in fact, her views were closer to his than she cared to admit, and that her rhetorical overstatement of her critique was fundamentally misguided. I'll take a very simple example. Because Kant talks about duty, the suggestion was that a duty-based ethic is one of submission. You just do your duty. The commander tells you what to do. The military officer says, go jump into the trenches and sacrifice yourself. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the lunatic who's the alleged caliph of this so-called Islamic State, tells you to put on a suicide belt to blow yourself up. That's duty, and that's where that leads. And I don't think that she understood what he meant by duty. What he meant by duty was doing the right thing, not obeying someone else blindly. And in fact, if someone gave you a command to do something that was wicked and wrong, like put on a suicide belt and blow other people up, it's your duty to disobey. So even at that point, I think that there was just a gross misunderstanding of what he meant. What he had in mind was that we are morally obligated to do the right thing. And that is not the same as submitting to the commands of some other person. By the way, I saw a little window pop up on my screen here about charity that asked about giving money to people on the street.
Okay.
So why don't I address that? That's an interesting question. I do give money to people on the street occasionally. I don't generally give it to people I think are able-bodied. And if it's fairly evident that this person has chosen not to work, I don't share my money with them. There are certainly cases when you can see this person is incapacitated in some way, maybe even through very bad choices that they made in the past, drug and alcohol dependency. But at that point, the way I look at it is, if I can help this person to have a meal, I'll do it. I don't do it all the time. I don't think I'm morally obligated to give money to every person that I ever encounter who asks for it, by any means. It is my money. I do work for it. I do have a moral, a legal claim over it. But I do share it with people in such circumstances. In cases when I have been pretty sure it will go to buy another bottle of booze, and see that's likely to be the case, I have instead gone into a store and bought them food. Of course, I'll go in and buy you a meal, because I'm not really interested in perpetuating that life, not for the favor to the person.
Have you ever had anybody turn you down on that? Tom, have you ever had anybody say no? I mean,
I don't think so. Even if it's all offering the person an apple or some fruit from a street vendor, I don't think so. But I also have to admit, I don't go through my life just always giving money to panhandlers on the street. Most of the charity that I have supported is groups such as Mercy Corps, which helps people in dire emergencies, on the one hand, and then also helps people to try to get on their feet. It's a philosophy of helping people to become able to help themselves, rather than perpetuating a dependence, which I think is generally not beneficial to other people.
Okay, you mentioned that we're winning the battle, I guess, for legalization of recreational chemicals of choice and so on. Are there any other optimistic examples you can give us where the forces of reason and liberty are prevailing over ideas that we've fought against for a long time?
Well, one that was a topic of discussion today at the Economic Freedom Network of Asia meeting is trade. Despite the prevalence of the zero-sum mentality in much of the human population, trade has been generally liberalized or freed up. That is to say, restrictions at international borders have been diminished, and that's a really wonderful thing. It's probably the most important single thing that has been driving global rise in living standards. And at any given moment, when someone looks out, the world isn't perfect. People in poverty, their life isn't perfect. I think we should look at trends over a longer period of time. And the fact is, hundreds of millions of people in just the last 2.5 decades, let's say 3 decades, have been lifted out of staggering poverty, just in India and China alone. When I say poverty, I mean very serious poverty. No electricity, no running water, no clean water, no access to simple things like eyeglasses so that you can see and read, and things that people in wealthier countries take for granted, opportunity for your children to go to school, and so on. And that has been driven by freeing trade, by lowering barriers to trade among nations. So that has been a very positive trend. There have been some ups and downs, but by and large, it's been upward. So that's another area where I've been optimistic, and I think that we may see a further lowering of barriers to trade in what are called non-tariff trade barriers in future. So I'm guardedly optimistic about that. I do think that there are real threats on the horizon, and as I said, one of the discussions among our participants here from a number of Asian countries was how to combat this mercantilism, zero-sum mentality that is always a threat. But by and large, I think we've been winning on that issue. Also on freedom of movement, and that's why this issue you raised earlier about the restrictions on movement that are being imposed or contemplated at present are so extremely dangerous. Because for many people around the world, the obstacles to traveling freely, to going where they want to go, have been falling in recent years. And I think it's a very positive trend. It's very, very much at risk. And we have to fight to maintain that freedom.
Well, thank you very much. One more thought. Since you're a scholar, can you tell us what you think are the most important intellectual battlefronts then? If we've been winning in some areas, where have we really just run into a brick wall, or where are we're just not making the arguments that people are seeing, or we're not making any progress on?
Question of which battlefront. There are battlefields, if you want to put it that way, or debates among intellectuals. And then there's popular discourse. I think that one of the areas where we have to work harder, I think we've been winning among, let's say, scholars and thinkers, is the benefits of immigration and freedom of movement. We have seen a diminution in restrictions on international travel. Unfortunately, there's a big movement to increase those restrictions. In Europe, in the United States, really ugly, ugly events and ugly responses. And what people are not seeing is that people who come to your country to work, to engage in positive sum games, are beneficial to you. People who invade it or blow things up, obviously, are not a benefit and may have to be kept out. Similarly, for people who think that they will come and merely receive benefits from the taxpayers. But in fact, the misunderstanding of most migrants is that they're lazy, that they just come to get welfare. Well, if you think about it for a little bit, those people fleeing from Syria, whatever we might say about them, they're not lazy. That's really hard to do. And then to get in a little boat and go across the Aegean, those are not lazy people. They're taking tremendous risks. So many have lost their lives. They're not lazy. We should make sure that when they come to societies in which we may live, that they meet the right conditions, which is to say the framework for positive sum gains, not going on welfare where they're dependent on the rest of the population, and that generates resentment. It generates dependency in their community, and the rest of the population will resent them. That is not a good outcome. Let them work. When people come and work and engage in those positive sum games, they're creating shared prosperity. So immigration into a country that is involved, where people are involved in voluntary exchange and they're allowed to work, is beneficial for the other people in that country as well. But that is the key. To allow labor markets to function, and people to find opportunity to add value to other people and to benefit themselves as well. And I'm afraid that we have not been very successful in explaining the benefits of migration to large numbers of people in wealthy countries. Let me add one other thing that has come out recently. A number of studies, one by Clemens, and it's been repeated by many others. Probably the most effective single thing one could do to reduce global poverty around the world today is to allow free migration. People who are living in very poor countries, Burkina Faso, for example, they're poor. They don't create very much wealth. The conditions for wealth creation are very, very meager. If that person goes from Burkina Faso to Oklahoma or Manitoba or Manchester or wherever, suddenly their productivity increases enormously. I mean, it's unbelievably more productive. they add so much more wealth. They are able to enjoy a better life in that circumstance, and the remittances that they send back to their families at home are enormous. They are incredibly huge. And the benefit of that is it's not like foreign aid, which usually goes to dictators and politicians to further ruin their countries. This goes back to mom so that she can pay for her medical care, and so she can pay for the education of your younger siblings. This builds a house for your parents, or a home for you to come back to. It builds a business. So the remittances represent added value in the countries to which migrants go, because they are paid by people who want their services, and then it helps to build their own home countries, or the countries of origin. The people there benefit in a very positive way that's quite different from foreign aid, which is largely destructive. So migration, if you allowed people to move to the areas where they could add the most value, would do more to eliminate poverty than anything else anyone has ever proposed.
And it doesn't cost the taxpayers anything.
Doesn't cost the taxpayers a nickel. There's a lot of information, openborders.info. It's a great website. Brian Kaplan at George Mason University and others maintain this. And there's just a robust discussion at that website and a wealth of information. It's an area where I think we're winning among scholars, among economists, among scientists, among intellectuals, but we are not winning in the general public. And that's an area where we have to do a better job.
Very good. Okay, we have one more question here. We have time for it. I don't know if you see it on the side. People are wondering if you have a religion, or if you're willing to share or discuss that.
How shall I put it? I think it is orthogonal to the question of my beliefs in justice. That is to say that you can be a believer in liberty and follow major world religions, and lots of other smaller religions. I know advocates of liberty, libertarians or classical liberals who are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, all sorts of religious views. And what they share is mutual respect and a belief in freedom. I personally would not characterize myself as a religious person, but the other people's religions don't bother me so long as they're willing to respect my rights. So extremists of whatever religion, Islamic State or the crazy people who claim to act in the name of Christianity and spread in Africa hatred of gay people and persecution, we can call them Christianists, if you will. Not those people, but people who follow their religions, they gain meaning from it, and they respect the rights of others. I respect them. And if somebody else finds solace after a terrible tragedy in that person's life, or the loss of a loved one, or a child dying, and their religion provides them solace, who am I to question them or to suggest that they shouldn't do that? So I'm happy if other people can find peace and contentment through although I personally do not embrace any.
Very good. Okay, well, unless we have one more question here, we'll give the audience a chance. We're almost out of time. I want to go ahead and thank you very much. It's been really interesting. You've actually given me some new ways of thinking about things in your more scholarly way, actually saying similar things. You don't have to be crushed by the system or become part of the system. There are other ways. There are new pathways. Oh, we do have one more question. Okay, if you're willing to give us 5 more minutes.
Okay.
I like that your title for this topic. What is your personal definition of love, and to love? What does to love mean to you?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Aristotle discusses love and friendship and the multitude of different meanings of the term. There's obviously, when we think love, in many societies immediately are oriented towards romantic love. But it's not the only kind of love. Love of a mother for her newborn baby of love. It's not romantic. It's a different kind of love. The love of two adult friends. They might be of the same gender, but it needn't be sexual or romantic, but there could be a very close bond and love between two people. There are all kinds of forms of love. But what it means fundamentally, the thing that all those have in common, is wanting the benefit of the other person as well as your own, as opposed to interactions in which you're predatory and you want to harm the other person. That's why Aristotle even talks about commercial friendships or friendships for gain. That even in business, there are kinds of friendships because there's mutual gain. It's not the case that all friendship has to be romantic or sexual or familial or just between buddies, but when you seek the profit or the gain of the other person. And that's why I talk about the love for the freedom of other people. See the freedom of other people as of having value and something that you want to promote. You want other people to enjoy freedom. If you have that attitude, you're in love with the freedom of other people, and it means you'll love your own freedom. In some sense, when people are romantically involved, I think that there's an element of self-love as well. Not a negative one, not selfish, greedy, horrible, all the negative ideas behind self-love, but you love another person, and you don't want to destroy and sacrifice yourself for that person. You want to enjoy the person's presence, whether it's a romantic love or just a deep personal friendship. There's a kind of self-love involved in that, as well as the love of the other person. So love is a situation in which you actively desire the well-being, the good outcome, the good life for the other person. And that's what it means to want liberty. We don't want other people to suffer. It's a sign of bad moral character when you want other people to suffer. People who have the zero-sum mentality. They want other countries to suffer so theirs can be great. In my opinion, it's stupid. It's a misunderstanding of economics and social interaction. And it's also a sign of bad moral character. We shouldn't be the kind of people who want others to hurt. We should love other people.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Those are words to the wise, very lovingly given and accepted in that spirit. You have a great day or evening, whatever's ahead of you in that time zone. And
8 o'clock in the morning here. But thanks so much. Great program, and I'm very, very happy that you invited me to be involved. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom.